Armed Services Committee meets this morning to receive testimony on worldwide threats. We are pleased to welcome our distinguished witnesses, Dan Coates, who is the Director of National Intelligence, and Lieutenant General Ben Stewart, Director of the Defense Intelligence Agency. Out of respect for the scheduling commitments of our witnesses and a unanimous request on the part of all our members, we will conclude this hearing at 11:30. In the interest of time, and to ensure the members of the committee to be able to ask their questions, I will be very brief. I know that comes as a disappointment, especially to the senator from South Carolina. I'd ask our witnesses to please submit their written statements for the record, if they can. That's not required, but anyway. Last night's horrific attack in Manchester was a gruesome reminder that the world is on fire. Everywhere we turn, we can see threats to the world's rules-based order that underpins global security and prosperity. Yet when it comes to the great national security challenges we face, U.S. policy and strategy are consistently lacking. Whether it's China, Russia, North Korea, Iran, or radical Islamist terrorism, I have heard few compelling answers about how the United States intends to use its alliances, its trades, its diplomacy, its values, but most of all its military to protect and defend our national interest and the rules-based order that supports them, especially with sequestration still the law of the land. This is still a young administration. Cogent, coherent policy and strategy take time to develop, but we should be ever mindful that our adversaries are not waiting for us to get our act together. Time is of the essence. Senator Reid.
Mr. Chairman, in keeping with your spirit, I will abbreviate my statement, but ask the full statement be made part of the record.
Without objection.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, for holding this important hearing. I also want to thank our witnesses for appearing here today to provide their analysis of the national security threats and other challenges facing us around the world. I would also like to welcome back our former colleague, Director Coates. Dan, how are you? For his first appearance before the committee, and General Stewart, thank you for your continued strong leadership of the intelligence professionals of the Defense Intelligence Agency. The national military strategy is organized appropriately so around the so-called 4+1 primary threats facing our nation today, namely Russia, China, North Korea, Iran, and the enduring non-state challenge of violent extremism, a tragic example of what we witnessed last evening in Manchester, England. And our hearts and prayers and thoughts go out to the people of England and the people of the world. We are pursuing these issues, and I know you gentlemen are at the forefront in terms of our intelligence efforts, and I appreciate what you do. The 4+1 threats I've just touched upon inform the capabilities we develop, the size of the force we build, and the scenarios we plan against. However, to paraphrase former Secretary Gates, we have a near-perfect record in predicting the nature of the next threat we will face. We've always gotten it wrong. We rely heavily on our intelligence community to highlight those emerging threats, the ones that we haven't identified already. And I hope our witnesses will provide the committee with their candid thoughts on the other challenges we should pay close attention to moving forward, in addition to the 4+1 that I've outlined. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Since a quorum is now present, I ask the committee to consider 6 civilian nominations and a list of 818 pending military nominations. First, I ask the committee to consider the nomination of Honorable David L. Norquist to be Undersecretary of Defense Comptroller, Robert Daigle to be Director of Cost Assessment Program Evaluation, Department of Defense, Elaine McCusker to be Principal Deputy Undersecretary of Defense Comptroller, Carrie Bingen to be Principal Deputy Undersecretary of Defense for Intelligence, Robert S. Karam to be Assistant Secretary of Defense for International Security Affairs, Mr. Kenneth P. Rapuano to be Assistant Secretary of Defense for Homeland Security and Global Security. Is there a motion to favorably report these 6 nominations to the
So moved.
Is there a second? All in favor say aye.
Aye.
The ayes have it. Welcome to our old and dear friend, Director Coates, and Lieutenant General Stewart, who continues to serve with distinction and with great honor. I thank you, Director Coates. Given your advanced age, we'd begin with you.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. You and I have an ongoing race between who's the more aged and experienced, and you win every time, which is quite an accomplishment. I'm pleased to be before you, Chairman McCain and Ranking Member Reid and members of the committee. I must admit, when I walked through the door, instinctively I made a right turn trying to find my seat up on the panel and said, oh yeah, that's right, I got to come down here.
You're welcome at any time to come and take a trip down memory lane during Mr. Coates.
Thank you. Let me just reiterate what the chairman said relative to what happened in Manchester last evening. I just returned from London a couple of days ago and met with all of my intelligence community colleagues there. We spent a significant amount of time discussing threats to our respective homelands, and it's a tragic situation that we see all too much of happening in countries around the world, in particular our allies. So it once again reminds us that this threat is real, it is not going away, and needs significant attention to do everything we can to protect our people from these kinds of attacks. I'm here today with Lieutenant General Vince Stewart from the DIA to discuss the IC's assessment of the multitude of threats facing our country. Vince will give some brief opening comments as well, and I've tried to condense my opening remarks, knowing this is an unclassified session, so that we'll have plenty of time for your questions. We're here to describe in an unclassified way the complexity of the threat environment, which is ever expanding and has challenged the IC to stay ahead of the adversary, and this has not been an easy task. We appreciate the support from this committee to address these threats in a way that will give the President, the Congress, and other policymakers the best and most integrated intelligence we can assemble. In the interest of time, I'll discuss just some of the many challenges that we currently face. The IC's written statement that was submitted earlier discusses these and many other threats in much greater detail. Let me start with North Korea. North Korea is an increasingly grave national security threat to the United States because of its growing missile and nuclear capabilities, combined with the aggressive approach of its leader, Kim Jong-un. Kim is attempting to prove that he has the capability to strike the U.S. mainland with a nuclear weapon. We assess that all flight tests this year, including the 2 this month, have demonstrated capabilities short of an ICBM at this point in time. However, North Korea updated its constitution in 2012 to declare itself a nuclear power, and its officials consistently state nuclear weapons as the basis for regime survival, suggesting Kim does not intend to negotiate them away. In Syria, we assess that the regime will maintain its momentum on the battlefield, provided, as is likely, that it maintains support from Iran and Russia. The continuation of the Syrian conflict will worsen already dangerous conditions for Syrians in regional states. Furthermore, as you all know, on April 4th, the Syrian regime used the nerve agent sarin against the opposition in Khan Sheikhoun in what was probably the largest chemical attack by the regime since August 2013. Since that sarin attack, we have observed more than 5 allegations of Syrian regime chlorine use. We assess that Syria is probably both willing and able to use chemical weapons in future attacks. We are still acquiring and continuing to analyze all intelligence related to the question of whether Russian officials had foreknowledge of the Syrian chemical weapon attack on 4 April. Let me turn to cyber threats. Cyber threats continue to represent a critical national security issue for the United States for at least 2 key reasons. First, our adversaries are becoming more bold, more capable, and more adept at using cyberspace to threaten our interest and to shape real-world outcomes. And the number of adversaries grows as nation-states, terrorist groups, criminal organizations, and others continue to develop cyber capabilities. And second, the potential impact of these cyber threats is amplified by the ongoing integration of technology into our critical infrastructure and into our daily lives. We see this today in the form of the WannaCry ransomware attack, which victimized companies, services, and individuals in well over 100 nations within days of its May 12 release. As this activity continues, the U.S. government investigation is ongoing. The worldwide threat of terrorism is geographically diverse and multifaceted, and it poses a continuing challenge for the United States, for our allies and partners who seek to counter it. ISIS is experiencing territorial losses in Iraq and Syria. However, we assess ISIS will continue to be an active terrorist threat to the United States due to its proven ability to direct and inspire attacks against a wide range of targets around the world. I might mention that ISIS has claimed responsibility for the attack in Manchester, although they claim responsibility for virtually every attack. We have not verified yet the connection. Outside Iraq and Syria, ISIS is seeking to foster interconnectedness among its global branches and networks, align their efforts to its strategy, and withstand counter-ISIS efforts. We assess that ISIS maintains the intent and capability to direct, enable, assist, and inspire transnational attacks. Al-Qaeda and its affiliates continue to pose a significant terrorist threat overseas as they remain primarily focused on local and regional conflicts. And homegrown violent extremists remain the most frequent and unpredictable terrorist threat to the United States homeland. This threat will persist, with many attacks happening with little or no warning. I'd like to take a quick run through some key areas of the Middle East. In Iraq, Baghdad's primary focus through 2017, we assess, will be recapturing and stabilizing Mosul and other territory controlled by ISIS. We assess that Iraq will still face serious challenges to its stability, political viability, and territorial integrity, even as the threat from ISIS is reduced. Reconstruction will cost billions of dollars, and ethno-sectarian and political reconciliation will be an enduring challenge. In Iran, Tehran's public statements suggest that it wants to preserve the Joint Comprehensive Plan of Action because it views the deal as a means to remove sanctions while preserving some nuclear capabilities. We assess that the JCPOA agreement has extended the amount of time Iran would need to produce enough fissile material for nuclear weapons from a few months to about a year. In the meantime, Tehran's malign activities continue. For example, Iran provides arms, financing, and training and manages as many as 10,000 Iraqi, Afghan, and Pakistani Shia fighters in Syria to support the Assad regime. Iran has sent hundreds of its own forces, to include members of the Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps, the IRGC, and IRGC Quds Force, to Syria as advisors. The re-election on 19 May of President Rouhani suggests the Iranian populace also broadly supports the JCPOA. Shortly before the election, Rouhani criticized the IRCG for attempting to sabotage the deal and called for Iran to restart interaction with the world and not be under, quote, the evil shadow of war. In Yemen, fighting will almost certainly persist in 2017 between Houthi-aligned forces trained by Iran and the Yemeni government, backed by a Saudi-led coalition. Neither side has been able to achieve decisive results through military force. Al-Qaeda in the Arabian Peninsula, AQAP, and ISIS branch in Yemen have exploited the conflict in Yemen and the collapse of government authority to gain new recruits and allies and expand their influence. The IC assesses that the political and security situation in Afghanistan will almost certainly deteriorate through 2018, even with a modest increase in military assistance by the United States and its partners. This deterioration is underpinned by Afghanistan's dire economic situation. Afghanistan will struggle to curb its dependence on external support until it contains the insurgency or reaches a peace agreement with the Taliban. Meanwhile, we assess that the Taliban is likely to continue to make gains, especially in rural areas. Afghan security forces' performance will probably worsen due to a combination of Taliban operations, combat casualties, desertions, poor logistics support, and weak leadership. Pakistan is concerned about international isolation and sees its position through the prism of India's rising international status including India's expanded foreign outreach and deepening ties to the United States. Pakistan will likely turn to China to offset its isolation, empowering a relationship that will help Beijing to project influence in the Indian Ocean. In addition, Islamabad has failed to curb militants and terrorists in Pakistan. These groups will present a sustained threat to the U.S. interests in the region and continue to plan and conduct attacks in India and Afghanistan. Russia is likely to become a more assertive nation in global affairs, more unpredictable in its approach to the United States, and more authoritarian in its approach to domestic politics. We assess that Russia will continue to look to leverage its military support to the Assad regime to drive a political settlement process in Syria on Russia's terms. Moscow is also likely to use Russia's military intervention in Syria in conjunction with efforts to capitalize on fears of a growing ISIS and extremist threat and expand its role in the Middle East. We also have noticed and discussed in significant detail, and may do so during this session, Russia's influence campaign and strategies to undermine democratic institutions and interfere with elections. As I said, I just returned from Europe, clearly in France in its election, now in Germany with its pending election, in England with its pending election. We are seeing duplications of what has happened here in our election, so the Russian strategy continues. Let me talk a little bit about Ukraine and Russia. We assess that Moscow's strategic objectives in Ukraine, maintaining long-term influence over Kiev and frustrating Ukraine's attempts to integrate into Western institutions, will remain unchanged in 2017. Russia continues to exert military and diplomatic pressure to coerce Ukraine into implementing Moscow's interpretation of the political provisions of the Minsk II agreement, among them constitutional amendments that would effectively give Moscow a veto over Kiev's strategic decisions. I'll finish up here with China. China will continue to pursue an active foreign policy, especially within the Asia-Pacific region, highlighted by a firm stance on competing territorial claims in the East China Sea and South China Sea, relations with Taiwan, and its pursuit of economic engagement across East Asia. China, which views a strong military as a critical element in advancing its interests, will also pursue efforts aimed at fulfilling its ambitious One Belt, One Road initiative to expand China's strategic influence and economic role across Asia through infrastructure projects. In the interest of time and to get to your questions, I will defer assessments on Western Hemisphere issues, which I trust we will discuss during the question period. However, I would like to make one final point on a key authority for the IC going forward. As you are all well aware, Section 702 of the FISA Amendments Act is due to expire at the end of the year. I cannot stress enough the importance of this authority and how the IC does its work to keep Americans safe. Section 702 is an extremely effective tool to protect our nation from terrorists and other threats. As I described in my confirmation hearing, 702 is instrumental to so much of the IC's critical work in protecting the American people from threats from abroad. We are committed to working with all of you to ensure that you understand not only how we use this authority, but also how we protect privacy and civil liberties in the process. In conclusion, the intelligence community will continue its tireless work against these and all other threats, but we will never be omniscient. Although we have extensive insight into many threats in places around the world, we have gaps in others. Therefore, we very much appreciate the support provided by your committee and will continue to work with you to ensure that the intelligence community has the capabilities it needs to meet its many mission needs. I will now turn to General Stewart for a few brief remarks.
Chairman McCain, Ranking Member Reed, members of the committee, thank you for this opportunity to appear with DNI Coats to provide an assessment of the threats to our national security. I concur with the Director's statement in its entirety. However, I'd like to reinforce for this committee, and by extension the American people, your Defense Intelligence Agency's view on 5 military threats facing the nation. We in DIA call these our no-fail missions because the risk is too high for us to fail in pursuing these missions. They include a nuclear-capable and increasingly provocative North Korea, a resurgent Russia, a modernizing China, an ambitious regional power in Iran, and violent extremist organization. The last category encompassing ongoing operations in Afghanistan, Iraq, Syria, and elsewhere. The world is focused on events in Pyongyang, and for good reasons. Since assuming power, Kim Jong-un has conducted 3 nuclear tests, and the regime has tested an unprecedented number of ballistic missiles of varying ranges over the past year. Although shortfalls remain, key milestones have been met in specific systems, and they continue to obtain valuable data and insights from each test. Let me be very clear on this point. If left on its current trajectory, the regime will ultimately succeed in fielding a nuclear-armed missile capable of threatening the United States homeland. While nearly impossible to predict when this capability will be operational, the North Korean regime is committed and is on a pathway where this capability is inevitable. Russia views military power as critical to achieving its key strategic objective and devotes significant resources to its military modernization program. The Russian government seeks to be the center of influence in what it describes as a multipolar post-West world order. To support this worldview, Moscow pursues aggressive foreign and defense policies by employing a full spectrum of influence and coercion aimed at challenging U.S. interests around the globe. Out-of-area operations remain a priority, as demonstrated by its ongoing deployment to Syria and long-range aviation approaching U.S. airspace. China is in the 3rd decade of an unprecedented military modernization program involving weapon systems, doctrine, tactics, training, space, and cyber operations. It now stands firmly in the category as a near-peer U.S. competitor. New bases are being built in the South China Sea, and evidence suggests that these outposts will be used for military purposes. A key component of China's strategy for regional contingency is planning for potential U.S. intervention in a conflict in the region. Its Navy remains on a course for 350 ships by the year 2020, and anti-access aerial denial capabilities continue to improve. Turning to Iran. Despite sanctions, Tehran is putting considerable resources into conventional military priorities such as ballistic and cruise missiles, naval systems, unmanned aerial vehicles, air defense systems that could threaten the U.S. and our interests in the region. Iran's conventional military doctrine is designed to protect Iran from the consequences of its assertive regional policy, spearheaded by the Iranian Revolutionary Guard's Quds Force and its regional proxy, Lebanese Hezbollah, and in concert with certain Iraqi Shia militias and the Houthis. We should expect Iran to continue to undermine the current regional security architecture, using terrorist organizations and proxies to complicate U.S. efforts throughout the region. Finally, we're making steady progress against trans-regional terrorism, but still have a long way to go. ISIS has been greatly diminished in Libya, will soon lose control of Mosul, and the capital in Raqqa is nearly isolated. We've killed many ISIS and al-Qaeda leaders, and numerous terrorist plots have been averted. The trend lines are moving in the right direction, but this fight will not end soon. The enemy remains highly adaptable and capable, and instability in undergoverned territory may give them opportunities to resurge. I am particularly concerned about the long-term impact of returning foreign fighters and the potential for these groups to capitalize on the proliferation of armed, unmanned aerial vehicles to do harm to U.S. and our allied interests. Mr. Chairman, the men and women of your DIA are providing unique defense intelligence around the world and around the clock to warfighters, defense policymakers and planners, and the defense acquisition community. They're doing so on the battlefield at combatant commands headquarters, here on the banks of the Potomac, and in the capitals of the world through our Defense Attaché Service. It has been a privilege to serve with them the last 2.5 years and see firsthand their service and contribution to our country. I look forward to the committee's questions.
Thank you very much. Director Coates, according to the Washington Post story this morning, President Trump asked two of the nation's top intelligence officials in March to help him push back against an FBI investigation into possible coordination between his campaign and the Russian government. According to current and former officials, Trump made separate appeals to the Director of National Intelligence, Daniel Coates, and to Admiral Michael S. Rogers, the Director of the NSA, urging them to publicly deny the existence of any evidence of collusion during the 2016 elections. Coates and Rogers refused to comply with the request, which they both deemed to be inappropriate. Is that an accurate reporting, Director Coates?
Mr. Chairman, as the President's principal intelligence advisor, I'm fortunate to be able and need to spend a significant amount of time with the President discussing national security interest and intelligence as it relates to those interests. We discuss a number of topics on a very regular basis. I have always believed that given the nature of my position and the information in which we share, it's not appropriate for me to comment publicly on any of that. So on this topic, as well as other topics, I don't feel it's appropriate to characterize discussions and conversations with the President.
And isn't it true that some of these leaks can be damaging to national security, Director Coates?
Leaks have become a very significant, played a very significant negative role relative to our national security. The release of information not only undermines confidence in our allies about our ability to maintain secure information that we share with them. It jeopardizes sources and methods that are invaluable to our ability to find out what's going on and what those threats are.
In light of the
lives are at stake in many instances, and leaks jeopardize those lives.
Thank you. In light of the tragedy in Manchester last night, doesn't it lend significant urgency to retaking Raqqa, where all this originates?
Well, that won't solve the problem, particularly the homegrown and inspired attacks, clearly going to the heart of ISIS and driving a stake through that heart. We assess will significantly improve the situation. The plotting and the planning that comes from a centralized caliphate or safe haven for ISIS, we've seen the damage that's occurred. We do assess, however, that its ideology and methods have spread like tentacles into many places, most of them ungoverned countries, and send some foreign fighters back home that might want to carry on their mission. But clearly the strategy, I believe, is the right strategy, and that is to go to the heart and disperse their planning and their leadership.
The Defense Science Board told this committee, at least in the next decade, the offensive cyber capabilities of our most capable adversaries are likely to far exceed the United States' ability to defend key critical infrastructure. Do you agree with that assessment?
I do. I do. I think cyber has risen to the top, close to the top of one of the most serious challenges that we face. As I mentioned in my opening statement, we need to see this as a very significant challenge to our public safety as well as the public health.
2 years in a row, we have authorized the provision of defensive lethal weapons in the Defense Authorization Bill to Ukraine. Do you believe we should seriously consider that in light of continued Russian aggression in the country?
Well, Mr. Chairman, that is a little bit outside my portfolio. It's a policy decision that perhaps General Stewart may want to discuss. But the we want to try to continue to provide the intelligence that would shape and fashion that decision among our policymakers, General Mattis and others.
Finally, on the issue of cyber, right now we have no policy, nor did we for the previous 8 years of the last administration. And so therefore, without a policy, we don't have a strategy. So therefore, when we don't have a strategy, we don't know how to act. Is that a true depiction of the scenario as we see it as far as cyber is concerned?
Well, I think we're learning that we do need to take this seriously, which we do. We do need to fashion a means by which we address these cyber attacks that are growing by the day. Our critical infrastructure is at risk. Our personal lives are at risk. Our financial community, commercial communities, military, and other entities that are important to our national security are at risk, and shaping a policy and a plan to address this, I think, rises to a top priority.
I want to thank you and General Stewart for your outstanding work for our country. Senator Reid.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. Thank you, both gentlemen. Director Coates, apparently the alleged call was prompted by the testimony of Mr. Comey that the FBI was conducting an investigation of the nature of any links between individuals associated with the Trump campaign and the Russian government, and whether there was any coordination between the campaign and Russia's efforts. In your capacity as director of all the intelligence services, including many aspects of the FBI, are you aware of such an investigation?
Well, I'm aware of the investigations that are underway, both by the House, the Senate, now Special Counsel,
and the FBI.
And the FBI, yes. Mm-hmm.
And do you have any reason to question the appropriateness of the investigations?
No, I think these investigations are in place to get us to the right conclusion, so that we can move on with a known result.
There are other allegations in the article which suggest that either the President or White House personnel contacted other people in the intelligence community with a request to drop the investigation into General Flynn. Are you aware of any other contacts, not just yourself personally, but to others in the intelligence community to conduct activity?
I am not aware of that.
Thank you. You have, and General Stewart have painted a very challenging picture of the threats that face us. Let me raise two specific issues. One, with respect to Iraq, there has been discussions in the Kurdish community of a referendum to declare essentially their independence or their desire for independence. In your estimation, Director Coates and General Stewart, what would that do to the ability of the Iraqi government to come together after the defeat of ISIS?
Well, it certainly adds an issue that is going to need to be worked through. As complicated as the situation is, it would add one more complication. I would turn to General Stewart relative to the military aspects of that.
Once ISIS is defeated in Mosul, the greatest challenge to the Iraqi government is to reconcile the differences between the Shia-dominated government, the Sunnis out west, and the Kurds to the north. Resolving the Kirkuk oil field and the revenues associated with the oil fields, resolving the ownership of the city of Kirkuk will be significant political challenges for the Iraqi government. Failure to address those challenges, coming up with a political solution, will ultimately result in conflict among all of the parties to resolve this and going back to what could devolve into civil strife in Iraq. Those are significant challenges. Kurdish independence is on a trajectory where it is probably not if, but when. And it will complicate the situation unless there's an agreement in Baghdad, an agreement that all of the parties can live with. So This is a significant referendum that comes up in October this year.
Thank you. Director Coates, just for a moment going back, I understand that you feel that you can't comment on any communications between you and the President, but just hypothetically, if a President reached out to the Director of National Security and made such a request, would you think that would be appropriate?
Mr. Vice Chairman, I made it clear in my confirmation hearing before the Senate Select Committee on Intelligence that my role and the role of the Director of National Intelligence is to provide information, intelligence information relevant to policymakers so that they can base their judgments on that any political shaping of that presentation or intelligence would not be appropriate. I have made my position clear on that to this administration, and I intend to maintain that position.
Thank you, Mr. Director. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Director Coates, in your opening statement, you just made a couple of brief comments about what happened in Manchester last night, and then you responded to a couple of questions. Is there anything that you'd like to elaborate on that incident last night, particularly when we have witness after witness coming in here talking about the threat, which you have talked about to this country, and it's only a matter of time? Anything else that you'd like to add in terms of last night's attack?
Well, in my discussions with my counterparts in London, MI5, MI6, the various intelligence agencies, and my counterpart to my position, their greatest concern was the inspired or homegrown violent extremist attacks, which are very hard to assess and detect. Initial reports that we have received are that it was indeed a suicide attack. Whether there were others implicated in that is under assessment. My counterpart actually will be boarding a plane to come to the United States to testify before, not sure which committee it is, and I'm sure he'll have some information on that. I have a call into him to try to see what the latest information is.
So you've had conversations
right
with
these
since this happened this morning? Or?
Pardon?
You've had conversations with these counterparts as recent since this happened?
I have my colleagues have in the IC have been talking. My direct discussion with my counterpart, he was actually briefing the Prime Minister at the time.
Very good.
We have a call teed up as soon as this hearing is finished.
Okay. On North Korea, we all know the significance of May 14th, the capability that's there, the anticipation that they're going to have the capability to do something with the payload that they can survive the exit and reentry strategy. This is already, that's a great concern, but it already was a concern to us. Now, I understand, and I've heard from different witnesses, that intelligence gathering in North Korea is more difficult than it is in other parts of the world. You can't use whistleblowers and some other things. Could you talk about the difficulty that is unique to North Korea in gathering information?
It is, if not one of the hardest collection nation that we have to collect against. You know, if you look at that satellite picture of the lights at night from the satellite, there's one dark area with no lights on, and that's North Korea. Their broadband is extremely limited, so using that as an access to collection is, we get very limited results. We do not have consistent ISR capabilities, and so there are gaps. The North Koreans know about these. So it becomes a difficult challenge relative to a society as closed and as isolated as North Korea is to get the right intelligence that we need.
Yeah, well, I know it's a problem, and that has to have make us question the accuracy of the product a little bit more than we would some of the other countries that were involved in intelligence.
Clearly.
On last hearing that we had, we talked quite a bit in some detail about the fact that we know in North Korea the big problem is that it's unpredictable. It's managed by someone who may be, mentally deranged, and so we have things that are true there that are not elsewhere. And they talk about the danger that is there. But they did also say in the last hearing that we had last week, they talked about maybe one of the opportunities we have is a new awakening in China, that China now may no longer be as close to them as it had been in the past. Do you see an opportunity? I noticed when you went over and did an excellent job, the 7 different areas of problems. The last one was China, but you didn't say anything about maybe a change that will enable us to make a little bit more progress in North Korea.
Well, as you know, the President had a very positive meeting with Prime Minister Xi. We have been working, our Secretary of State and others have been working very closely with the Chinese. We see them as playing a very integral role in dealing with the situation in North Korea. And in fact, it's probably and there is a strategy in place relative to sort of a ratcheting up of efforts with China to influence North Korea to decease their nuclear weapons goals. So that, along with the election in South Korea, with its new president, is part of our strategy to leverage efforts against North Korea to get them to reassess their current strategy.
Thank you, Director Coates.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you both for being here this morning. Director Coates, you talked about Russia's influence campaign and its effort to undermine Western elections, as we saw here in 2016, saw in France, we're seeing in Germany. So far, we have failed to hold Russia accountable for that interference, which, would you agree, sends a message to other countries that would threaten our cybersecurity here at home, that we have failed to hold Russia accountable?
Well, I think we're looking at every opportunity to hold Russia accountable and determine, I think it's still in process in determining what kind of actions that we should take, but there clearly is a consensus that Russia has meddled in our election process, as it is in Germany, as it is. I was in France just after the election of Macron, and that clearly had Russian influence, attempting to address that election. I was in Berlin. Germany is facing the same thing. The UK is experiencing the same thing with an election coming up. We see this happening all across Europe. Russia's always been doing these kind of things with influence campaigns, but they're doing it much more sophisticated through the use of cyber and other techniques than they did before.
And they haven't actually tried to influence the outcome of our elections in the past in the same way that they did in 2016, as we heard from our intelligence community. Do you think it would be helpful for Congress to pass increased sanctions on Russia that would be a response to what they did in our elections? There's a bipartisan bill in Congress that's been introduced that would have a significant impact on Russia.
Well, I would leave that to my former colleagues. I've had to remove my policy hat, which has not been easy, after a career in politics, and put on my intelligence hat. My goal and job now is to provide you with the intelligence to make those decisions, and that would, I keep having to correct myself and say, whoops, I'm not supposed to go there. That's up to our executive and congressional branch to make the policy that they feel is necessary to address the problem.
Well, I certainly hope that the administration will come out with a proposal that will hold Russia accountable at some point in the near term. Let me ask you, though, about pointing to the events of last night in Manchester, that horrible tragedy, and the threat posed by transnational terrorism. Both of you have talked about that. And I think that points to the need for robust intelligence sharing. So what kind of message does it send to our allies that we have revelations that classified information was disclosed in a meeting with Secretary Lavrov? And just let me point out, this is an issue that has been raised with me recently by a high-ranking official of one of our closest allies about whether their country could count on information that was shared with us with being kept secret.
Well, one of the purposes of my trip was to ensure that we maintain that kind of relationship that you're talking about. It's essential, given the threats that we face today, that we are all in on dealing with this issue. There's no safe haven anymore among our allies in terms of being a target for an attack. And the better that we can share information, the better that we can maintain our relationships and trust those relationships, the better able we are to prevent these kinds of attacks. I would say two things. One, we've had some significant successes in providing information back and forth relative to preventing attacks. But secondly, to a country, the consensus is the most difficult attack to prevent is that which is inspired by an individual.
Sure, and I think the members of this...
by someone who just has a hatred and wants to do damage.
I don't want to interrupt Director Coates, but I think all of us on this committee understand that, and I'm about out of time, and I do want to ask you, have you reassured our own men and women in the intelligence community that their work to protect this country and their relationships will be safeguarded?
Oh, absolutely. My initial response, my initial message to all of the intelligence community is, do your job. Provide us the best intelligence of any entity in the world. Keep your focus on what we're here to do, and I'm confident that that's what's happening. I know General Stewart wanted to make a comment.
We remain focused on our missions. Nothing has changed. Our relationship with our partners have grown over the last year. I've seen no indication that our partners are walking away from us in collaborating and sharing insights on the threats we face around the world. None.
Thank you.
They're very worried, General. Senator Fisher.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I want to thank both of you gentlemen for being here today and for your service to this country. General Votel and General Nicholson have both testified about Russia's assistance to the Taliban, and recent news reports have suggested that it is increasing to include weapons, logistical and financial support, and even medical treatment to Taliban fighters. What do each of you assess Russia's goal to be in Afghanistan? And General, if you could also discuss the impact that this assistance has had on the battlefield.
So Russia continues to view itself, as I mentioned earlier, as a global power. It's going to be influencing actions around the world. Its narrative is that primarily ISIS in the Khorasan province is a threat to the Central Asian states and ultimately a threat to Russia. That's their argument. It's a pretty weak argument, and they use that argument as the avenue to get the Taliban forces to fight ISIS Khorasan province. So they're in conversation with Taliban. We've seen indications that they've offered some level of support, but I have not seen real physical evidence of weapons or money being transferred. They have had conversation because they want to be part of the solution, quote unquote, solution in the Afghan theater. So they're going to continue to meddle, and they're going to continue to bet on all of the horses, including the Taliban, so that they'll have a say at the seat when there's a political solution.
Director.
Well, I am privileged to be able to serve with General Stewart. One of the great things that about this job that I inherited is that I inherited a group of people that are experienced in the areas that they direct, and they've been enormously supportive and helpful. And so I think it points out the fact that the IRPTA Act, which was passed in 2005, I believe it was, and enacted in 2006, has really benefited in terms of our ability to reach out to all of the 16 agencies to collect the information necessary to integrate that into a coherent and effective intelligence assessment.
And would you agree with the General's assessment of Russia's involvement then?
I agree with that. Yes, I do.
Thank you. And both of you in your opening statements, you note that increasing investments are being made by other nations with regard to their nuclear forces, especially Russia and China. And Director in General, how does that discussion of the escalate to de-escalate approach to nuclear weapons affect a change in the Russian thinking or planning with respect to the use of nuclear weapons?
Russia builds nuclear capability with the intent of using it on the high end of conflict for war termination, or de-escalate to de-escalate, or some people call escalate to terminate, idea that if the crisis is going in a decidedly negative way for Russia, that the tactical use of nuclear weapons will discourage further actions by NATO or U.S. forces. So the idea is tactical use of nuclear weapons causes us to pause, causes us to think about whether we want to continue to fight, and create the opportunity where they can settle the contest in more favorable terms. They're the only country that I know of that has this concept of escalate to terminate or escalate to de-escalate, but they do have that built into their operational concept. We've seen them exercise that idea, and it's really kind of a dangerous idea because it then could escalate to further escalate.
Have you seen any indication that they are changing their path on that at all?
None. No, Senator.
With regards to China and their modernization efforts, do you see any of their views with nuclear weapons? Do you see any of their views changing?
Certainly nuclear weapons and modernization of their nuclear force is an integral part. All of these countries view nuclear weapons as the guarantor of their regime. It's much like North Korea. So China continues to modernize all levels, including nuclear forces, including capability to deter U.S. forces from entering the West Pacific. They don't talk about a first use, but they do talk about use of nuclear weapons as part of warfighting.
I might add to that, despite the heroic and really credible efforts by former Senators Nunn and Lugar toward minimizing and reducing the use of nuclear weapons, the success we had in Libya, the success we had in Ukraine, unfortunately, the lessons learned have been, if you have nuclear weapons, never give them up, because it's a deterrent from things from other actors who may want to interfere in your country. If you don't have them, get them. And so we see what's happened in Ukraine. Probably would not have happened if they had maintained nuclear weapon capability. But we see what's happening in North Korea, who believes that regime survival is dependent solely on becoming a nuclear power. And so we, unfortunately, tend to be moving in the wrong direction as countries around the world think that gaining nuclear capability is the protection, either deterrent or for survival of their country, or potentially it could be used for offensive capabilities.
If I could follow up with you later, Mr. Director, I would appreciate it. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Director Coates, if a memo exists documenting you or Admiral Rogers' conversations with the President regarding the Russia investigation, will you make those documents available to Special Counsel Robert Mueller and the Congressional Intelligence Committees?
I have no documents to make relevant.
Okay. In an opinion piece in the New York Times last week, it called Israel the eyes and ears of the United States in the Middle East when it comes to intelligence. Would you agree with that assessment?
Israel is a very valued partner in terms of supporting us in any number of ways, including intelligence sharing.
The piece also suggests that President Trump's alleged unsanctioned sharing of highly sensitive information that we received from Israel could do permanent damage to this special intelligence relationship. Without speaking to what President Trump may have revealed to Foreign Minister Lavrov and Ambassador Kislyak, could the unsanctioned sharing of highly classified information from Israel or other countries with whom we have intelligence partnerships harm those relationships and therefore our ability to gather intelligence and protect Americans?
I've not seen any evidence of that or any reporting relative to anything that would lead to that conclusion.
With regard to the documents, whether they exist or not, if you get called in front of the Intelligence Committee, will you share your conversations with President Trump in that hearing, in that setting?
Well, as I mentioned to Senator McCain in answer to his question, I do believe that the information and discussions that I've had with the President are something that should not be disclosed. On the other hand, if I'm called before an investigative committee, I certainly will provide them with what I know and what I don't know.
Reports indicate that Moscow is a lifeline to Pyongyang in a way that might undermine international pressure to convince North Koreans to give up their nuclear programs. Please describe what you can tell us in an open setting about the extent of Russia's ties to North Korea.
I'm sorry, would you repeat that last statement?
Can you describe to us in this open setting the extent of Russia's ties to North Korea?
That is something I think I would rather reserve for a classified session.
Okay. Researchers at Kaspersky Labs reportedly found evidence linking the recent global ransomware attack to North Korea cyber operatives. The North Korean nuclear threat is clear and present. So too is the cyber threat that the country opposes to us and our allies. How do you think about the most recent attack, if it was by the North Koreans, fits into your plans?
Well, I'm sorry. Would you state that question again?
How do you think this most recent attack, if it was by the North Koreans, fits into their plans?
Well, we don't have evidence yet to confirm that there has been that link. We do know North Korea possesses the capability of doing this kind of thing, but we're still assessing as to what the source is.
Mm-hmm. Do you feel we are prepared to meet further cyber challenges from North Korea and other actors?
I think we need a constant evaluation and engagement in terms of how we deal with cyber and the threats that it poses to us. The question was asked earlier, and I agree. This has risen to a significant, if not the most significant threat to the United States at this current time. And we ought to, our policymakers need to be fully engaged, I believe, in how we deal with these, both from a defensive and perhaps an offensive way of addressing this particular issue. So I've been outspoken relative to the need to do this, and we will continue to provide as much intelligence as we can to support that view.
Do you believe that our voting infrastructure is critical infrastructure? And do you believe we should have a national security plan so that each of the states have to be certified for cyber compliance and cyber resiliency?
I think those are two very relevant issues that ought to be thought through, and policy ought to be devised and defined in terms of how we best address that. But on the critical infrastructure side, we are so interconnected now that it poses a major threat to the United States and our individual states also.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Gentlemen, first of all, thank you for your service to our country. Director Coates, you began a conversation in response to Senator Fisher's question with regard to nuclear weapons. And you made an interesting statement that what we're learning is that if you have nuclear weapons, you keep them, and if you do not have nuclear weapons, you get them. For a lot of years now, many of our allies have depended upon arrangements or agreements with the United States in which we are carrying nuclear weapons, and that we, in many cases, are responsible for carrying that nuclear deterrence so they don't have to, which keeps nuclear weapons out of other countries' hands, but it also requires a responsibility for us. You suggested something here which is critical, and that is that those countries out there are learning a different understanding of the world that perhaps is not consistent with our message to them. Could you elaborate on this in terms of your analysis of the information, and why is it you believe right now that that is their belief, that if they have them, they keep them, and if they don't have them, they need to get them?
Well, it's just an assessment of mine. It's almost a personal. I wasn't quoting an intelligence community report. I was simply saying it appears that based on what has happened in past years here, relative to the nuclear capability question, that
Is it due, sir, to a policy that was not followed up on? Was it
No,
something that we failed to follow up on to reassure our allies?
Well, I think that's a relevant question that you ask, and I don't know that I have the answer. But I do know that, I don't know, but I believe that, and have heard, that some of the narrative out there relative to the situation in Ukraine has led some thinking along the regard of, and then watching what's happening in North Korea and how they have basically linked nuclear weapon even possession and capability, even by amending their constitution to declare themselves a nuclear state.
Would it be fair to say that for those who are our allies, that it would be appropriate for us to reinforce our policy provisions in defense of their own security where we have made that commitment? Would that be appropriate?
I think it would be appropriate. I think we want to reassure our policy allies that we have the capabilities to provide that. At the same time, we're basically saying, you know, we have to up our game, whether it's conventional or whatever, because these threats are real, and having the capability to address these. I would like to turn to General Stewart to let him follow up on that
If I can offer this, I think our allies are very comfortable with the arrangements, the protection that comes from our nuclear umbrella. It's the rogue states, and it's not just about nuclear capability. Rogue states are looking for anything that will guarantee their survival and their hold on power. And one of those things that they believe guarantees their hold on power is to have a nuclear device that can threaten either its neighbors or the United States.
But General, you would not consider the Ukraine a rogue state, would you?
No, but
And yet they must have that thought process there, and I would consider them to be an ally of ours.
I don't know if they fall in the allied category, to be honest. I know they're a strong partner. I don't know that we have an alliance with the Ukraine, but I suspect that the Ukrainian government probably views that the fact that they gave up much of their capability as part of the disarmament put them at greater risk and greater pressure from the Russian government. So I would imagine that right now they probably wish they had some lethal, to go back to Senator McCain's question, some lethal capability that could hold at risk Russian interference in their government and in their way of life.
But among our allies, you're suggesting that they have a strong belief that we would respond if necessary, and you do not see our allies who do not currently have nuclear weapons as feeling that our policies are clear and that our resolve is clear as well?
That's a fair statement, Senator.
And I agree with that assessment. I was not attempting to suggest otherwise, but rogue states or marginal states, I think, are thinking on a different level than that, but not our allies.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Director Coates, you've refused today to confirm or deny whether the President asked you to intervene with Director Comey. If you are asked for those details by Special Counsel Bob Mueller, will you be forthcoming?
Yes, I will.
You said earlier, lives are at stake and leaks jeopardize those lives. If the President held any other position in our government, what he told the Russians could be considered the mother of all leaks. Was it dangerous for the President to share that classified information with the Russian government?
Well, I wasn't in the room, and I don't know what the President shared. All I have read is public.
So you haven't discussed this? All you've read is the public reports?
I have not expressed. I've been, first of all, I've been on travel, and secondly,
You've been on travel.
And I have not discussed this issue with the President.
I find that troubling.
Well, I was in Europe, and he was in the White House.
Can you describe the interagency process that the intelligence community undertakes when deciding what intelligence information can be shared with a foreign government?
Well, we worked through a process. I can't specifically describe that process here today. I'm new to the job, weeks in, but there are procedures and processes in place. I'd be happy to get those back to you.
Did the Trump administration undergo that interagency clearance process prior to the President's May 10th meeting with the Russian government?
I have no awareness of that.
So if they did, you're not aware of it?
I'm not aware of it, no.
That's disappointing, but shifting gears, I've got another question I want to get to the bottom of, having to do with whether or not the Office of the Director of National Intelligence has received any guidance from the Trump administration, either written or verbally, that the ODNI, or any other agency for that matter, is not to respond to oversight inquiries from members of Congress.
I'm not aware of any information to that extent.
No information to say that they will only respond to chairs and ranking members?
To my knowledge, no.
Thank you. Mr. Chair, I'm going to yield back.
Thank you, gentlemen, for being here today. Director Coates, we do expect an announcement on the President's new strategy in Afghanistan shortly. And what I hope we don't hear is an accelerated plan of what we've already been doing in Afghanistan. I do hope that we see some new ideas, and hopefully the plan that we see is one that will take into account a broader strategic problem, and something that we all understand and know is that we cannot address terrorist groups in Afghanistan on the ground without addressing their safe havens in Pakistan. And so my question to you is, what steps do we need to see Afghanistan's neighbors take to help stabilize that region, and how do we make sure that they are following through?
Well, once again, we provide the intelligence relative to the policymaking, but to directly answer your question, I think certainly an evaluation of how we work with Pakistan to address the situation of the harboring of terrorist groups would be essential to a strategy that affects Afghanistan going forward in Afghanistan, because that is a potential of very disrupting situation, putting our own troops at risk and undermining the strategy of dealing with the Taliban and local groups that are trying to undermine the government. So it's a very clear link that I think would have to be addressed in conjunction with whatever is done in Afghanistan.
Thank you. And General Stewart, I had the pleasure of flying into Afghanistan with you last year at Thanksgiving time, so it was very good to catch up with you. Besides more troops, which I anticipate might be part of the plan that we see, do we need to implement a different strategy on the ground in Afghanistan?
Thanks, Senator. Again, I hate to talk about either policy or strategy and not just intel. So let me frame the response this way. Pakistan views Afghanistan, or desires for Afghanistan, some of the same things we want: a safe, secure, stable Afghanistan. One addition: one that does not have heavy Indian influence in Afghanistan. Mm-hmm. They view all of the challenges through the lens of an Indian threat to the state of Pakistan. So they hold in reserve terrorist organizations. We define terrorist organizations. They hold them in reserve so that if Afghanistan leans towards India, they will no longer be supportive of an idea of a stable and secure Afghanistan that could undermine Pakistan interests. So we've got to get a couple of things. One, very clear that Afghanistan's security and stability is in the interest of all of the parties in the region and does not pose a threat to Pakistan. We've got to convince Pakistan that if they're harboring any of the Haqqani network members, that it is not in their interest to continue to host the Haqqani network, that we ought to be working together to go after those 20 terrorist organizations that undermine not just Afghanistan, not just Pakistan, but all of the region. And so we've got to make sure we're pushing them to do more against the Haqqani network. They separate the Taliban from the Pashtun. They want a Pashtun-dominated Afghanistan. So we got to get the conversation going again with Pakistan about their role in not harboring any of these terrorists, helping to stabilize Afghanistan, and I think maybe we'll have some progress. They also have some influence in bringing the parties to the table. So we got to get them to think about reconciliation, that the status quo is not in their best interest.
Mm-hmm. Do you think that we can frame the intelligence in a way that would state that we need Pakistan to be a good friend to not only Afghanistan and the United States in order for the United States to be a good friend to Pakistan?
I am hoping to do just that in the weeks ahead, ma'am.
Okay, thank you. I'll yield back my time. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I want to thank both the witnesses for being here. We are greatly appreciative of your hard work, and Director, everyone back home in Indiana is very, very proud of you, and we feel more safe in our country having you in that position. In February, North Korea tested a solid fuel missile, which we were told caught the U.S. by surprise. My understanding from STRATCOM is that the type of fuel, the launcher erector, and even the location of the test were not anticipated. And just over a week ago, North Korea tested a missile they say is capable of carrying a nuclear warhead. One at a time, are either of you able to confirm whether the recent missile tested is in fact capable of carrying a nuclear warhead?
I would prefer not to talk about that in this setting, Senator.
I was just about to say that.
Okay.
Same thing.
General Stewart, can you speak to what technological hurdles North Korea would need to overcome in order to successfully mate a nuclear warhead to an ICBM capable of reaching the U.S. and surviving reentry?
The technical hurdle remains in the survival of the reentry platform. They've certainly demonstrated a range of missiles, a range of fuel types, a range of boosters. They have the Taepodong-2 that launched space launch vehicles, so that has, if modified, could have intercontinental range. The single hurdle that we've not seen all the pieces put together is the reentry vehicle surviving the atmosphere. But that's really a matter of enough trial and error to make that work. They understand the physics, so it's just a matter of design.
I was just going to talk to you about the trial and error. You hear sometimes folks almost smile that they've had a failure or something in their testing. But to me, and I want to check with you, to me, the way you learn is by trying and by doing. And the fact that it's a failure is not so much a failure for North Korea. They are learning all the time, and it's becoming of increasing concern. Would you agree with that?
They not only are learning with every test, but they're not encumbered by some of the challenges we have in our safety and acquisition program. So they will take greater risk And so the timeline where we would see things and we'd say, based on our model, it will take 7 years. They're accelerating that timeline because they're not encumbered by some of the bureaucratic burdens that we have in our weapons acquisition program.
Understanding that North Korea may not currently be able to deliver a nuclear weapon to the continental United States, can you speak to their capability to use a nuclear weapon against South Korea, where we have 30,000 troops stationed, or Japan, where we have 50,000 troops stationed?
I would not want to answer that in this hearing, Senator.
Thank you. Let me ask you about something else, and that would be the Chinese and their efforts to try to affect the decision-making by Kim Jong-un. Have you seen any indication that they have become more serious in this effort, that they are taking the kind of steps necessary to alter Kim Jong-un's decision-making process? Have you seen that they are aware of the sufficient grave situation we have here? And then, as a follow-up on that, what do you think are the kind of steps that China could take that might actually get Kim Jong-un's attention?
We certainly have been able to get their attention, and they have taken some steps. At this point, it has not produced the results that we had hoped. Secretary Tillis has said that defines this as a series of steps relative to increasing pressure on North Korea, and that we're just at the early stages of that. So clearly, China's engagement in helping us address this issue is critical, deemed that way, and we continue to work with the Chinese in that regard. Beyond that, I would think the opportunity to address that to Secretary Tillerson. Mentioned one of my colleagues.
I knew who you meant.
Tillerson, to get a better detail of what we are trying to do. But clearly, China needs to play a role. It's been suggested that, speaking of Senator Tillis, he just walked in, I equated you with the Secretary of State. You're smiling, so I'm not sure you want that job, but anyway. The ability, it has been publicly stated that China has rejected some coal imports from North Korea to somewhat significant efforts. There's a question about oil that is provided and other economic issues, but it really falls outside of my category and more into the Secretary of State's category.
Understood. Thank you both. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you both for very compelling testimony. When it comes to Russia, former director of the CIA, Brennan, said today that Russia brazenly interfered in our 2016 election. Do both of you agree with that?
I agree. We have high confidence from all of our sources that there was a significant involvement.
Do you agree with that, General?
Yes, Senator.
Okay. Iran, the president said this morning, I think, in Israel, that Iran will not be allowed to get a nuclear weapon. Director Coates, do you believe that the current agreement with Iran regarding their nuclear program will accomplish this goal?
No, I think it was made clear that it would not accomplish this goal. It would only accomplish a deferment relative to their having a free hand at developing nuclear capability.
Do you agree with that, General?
It defers the effort, and I don't see any indication that Iran is pursuing breaking out of that deal at this point.
The question is, does it accomplish the goal of denying them nuclear capability?
Ultimately, it does not deny forever.
Okay.
It defers for 10 years, if I understand the agreement.
Okay. Iran, do you agree, is more aggressive since the agreement in terms of activity within the region?
We've seen a lot of malign efforts on the part of Iran that are very provocative. Secretary, on the confirmation of the last 90-day certification that has to be signed every 90 days relative to the Iranian compliance with the JCPOA. While the intelligence did not suggest a breach that would deny confirming that,
The question is, have they been more aggressive in the region?
Absolutely more aggressive.
Do you agree with that, General?
I don't know that I would necessarily say they're more aggressive. Their actions in Syria was the same.
What about Yemen?
In Yemen, that's picked up because
Would you say they're a destabilizing force in the region?
Absolutely.
Is there any indication they've taken the sanctions money and put it in roads, schools, and hospitals?
That would be impossible to detect effectively.
Is it fair to say that they've increased their military capabilities since the agreement?
Some of the money that they've gained has gone to military. The preponderance of the money has gone to economic development and infrastructure.
Okay. Is Iran a greater threat or a lesser threat since the agreement? Or the same?
I would say it's certainly a threat to the region. Whether it's greater or lesser, based on the agreement,
Okay.
I'm not sure I can assess that.
How do you get on the ballot in Iran to run for president?
The question is, how do you?
Yeah, how do you get on the ballot to run for president in Iran?
Well, it looks like you can get on the ballot, but that you can get kicked off.
Yeah. Who has the final say who gets on the ballot?
I think it's the supreme leader.
Do you agree with that, General Stewart?
Yes, sir.
Nobody's on the ballot he doesn't want. North Korea, is it the policy of the United States to stop North Korea from developing a missile with a nuclear weapon on top that could hit America, or is it the policy of the United States to contain that threat by trying to shoot it down if they launch it?
It's the policy of the United States to prevent it.
You agree with that, General Stewart?
Yes, Senator.
So that would mean all options are on the table to prevent it. Is that correct?
I'm certainly not in a position to remove any of the options.
Okay. ISIL. Our strategy to take Raqqa back has a heavy reliance on YPG Kurds. Are you both familiar with that?
Yes.
Yes.
Is that creating friction with Turkey?
Yes.
Yes.
Do you agree that it would be better if we had more Arabs in the fight and less Kurds from a regional point of view?
I think General Mattis is the best person to answer that question, and I think he's very comfortable with what the balance is.
From an intelligence point of view, do you see growing friction between Turkey and Kurdish elements in the region?
It appears likely.
Is that being driven by our policy to arm the YPG Kurds with heavy weapons?
I think it contributes to it.
Do either one of you know anything about Bitcoin?
You know, I tried to figure out what it was, and I never got a good answer, or at least one that I could comprehend. I'm still using dollars and coins.
Me too, but could you do me a favor and look at that issue and report back to the committee whether or not you believe Bitcoin will become the currency of terrorists and criminals down the road?
We'd be happy to look into that. I think there's some indication that it is being used for that purpose, but we can give you an assessment of that.
Sequestration would be a disaster for both of your agencies if it kicked back in.
It would continue to cut into real capability.
Same for you.
It's a little difficult for me to answer that question relative to the community as a whole. But it would depend on what other supplemental measures of resources would be available.
Thank you both.
On behalf of Chairman McCain, Senator Warren, please.
Thank you. And I don't want to duplicate the questions that others have asked, important questions. So what I'd like to do is just take up another area about a serious threat to our security and economic issues around the world, and that's climate change. The science is unmistakable. Human activities are releasing greenhouse gases into the atmosphere and contributing to climate change. A Defense Department report from 2 years ago observed global climate change will have wide-ranging implications for U.S. national security interests over the foreseeable future because it will aggravate existing problems such as poverty, social tensions, environmental degradation, ineffectual leadership, and weak political institutions. In short, this DoD report describes climate change as a threat multiplier. Director Coates, do you agree?
I don't know if I would describe it as a threat multiplier, although our job is simply to not is to assess the consequences of potential changes in climate relative to migration, relative to humanitarian issues. The science falls to the other federal agencies.
Well, but that is the question.
There certainly, I think, there have always in the history of the world been reactions to different climate changes, and it is an issue that continues.
Well, and the Department of Defense report has identified that climate change exacerbates, aggravates, this is their words, existing problems, poverty, social tensions, environmental degradation, ineffectual leadership, and weak political institutions. Do you disagree with any of that?
No, I don't disagree. I'm simply saying that I think that has been an ongoing issue throughout the ages.
Well, so let me ask the question this way then. How should we be integrating climate change risks into our national security strategy?
We should be assessing what the consequences of changes that are relevant to security issues, that should be part of the assessment, and it is.
Well, climate change is clearly a threat to international peace and security, and I just think it's critically important that we take this seriously and we adapt accordingly. Let me ask you another question, and this is a question others have asked about the interference of the Russians in our election and now in other elections. You talked about this in your opening statement. The question I want to ask about is, we all agree that interference by foreign actors in our democratic process is unacceptable, but right now it doesn't seem like we are doing enough about it. So my question, Director Coates, is what more do we need to do to make sure the U.S. is sufficiently prepared to defend against Russian-style cyber attacks on our elections, and particularly those that could escalate to attempted manipulation directly of voting machines or alteration of registration rolls in our 2018 and 2020 elections?
Well, that's a matter for those of you sitting on the dais here. That's a policy decision that the country needs to make. We provide the intelligence on the basis of the accuracy of what to the best of what we can, what has happened. The response to what has happened is something that the executive can correct.
So you don't have any advice on this?
My job is to provide the intelligence. My job is not to make policy.
Okay.
It used to be when I sat up there.
Could I ask it differently? Do you think we should treat our election systems as critical infrastructure and provide cybersecurity assistance directly to state and local officials?
Oh, I think that's something we certainly should do. Anybody who's trying to undermine the democratic institutions of the United States, it ought to be addressed.
Thank you. You know, when he recently testified before a Judiciary Subcommittee on Russian interference in our elections, your predecessor, James Clapper, said, our election apparatus should be considered critical infrastructure and should have the protections that are tended to that. And I think he's right on this. Protecting our election systems from vulnerability should be part of our cyber defense strategy.
I agree with that.
Good. I'm glad to hear that. Thank you very much. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
I might add to that that we do not have an assessment that any of our voting machines were tampered in this election.
I understand your point. Thank you.
On behalf of Chairman McCain, Senator Tillis, please.
Thank you, Senator Reid. Director Coates, it's great to see you. We miss you here, but we're glad you are where you are. And
there are days when I miss you.
General Stewart, not all days, but General Stewart, thank you for being here and for your service. Just a quick follow-up question. To what extent do you think the aggressive actions of Russia, Iran, ISIS, North Korea, and China, their current strategies, the threats that they represent today, are inspired by their concern with climate change? based on your intelligence
I
assessments?
have not seen anything in intelligence circles that says their policies, their approaches driven by climate change.
Any. Thank you. I want to spend most of my time, and I'm going to be brief so that we've got a vote coming up and defer to my colleagues, but I want to go back to your opening statement, Director Coates. You were talking about Section 702 and the need for reauthorization. Can you give us some sense for public consumption of how that, how that tool has been used to identify real threats and potentially intervene before a bad action takes place, some rough order of magnitude, if not specific numbers?
A lot of those threats, a lot of our threats come from foreign sources, and when we have information that leads us to a potential foreign source, then examination of that in terms of what they might be planning to do, who they may be talking to in terms of accomplish an attack on the United States, has been an invaluable piece of information that has prevented many, many attacks. As I mentioned earlier, it is also to the great gratitude of our allies in Europe and elsewhere, prevented numerous threats that could have turned into disastrous attacks. And so it's been a very essential element of our collection process. We obviously, as we all know, we're talking here about foreign non-U.S. persons that have bad intentions toward the United States. It may be that those persons are connecting with someone here in the United States, and we want to make sure what is being transferred in that regard. During that process, it's possible that U.S. citizens' names are mentioned in an email, mentioned in a verbal way, and that then is, we give immediate attention to what we call minimization, and that is we want to make sure we're not doing collecting on those persons. The program has adapted to ensure that we provide privacy protections for U.S. persons. And there is a process that we go through, minimization being one of those. We also have oversight. It's the most overseen business effort that the United States has against any policy matter or agency in government. All three branches have oversight capability in the program to ensure the privacy of individuals. So I think there's a lot of misunderstanding about what 702 is and what it isn't, but we have scheduled and will continue to schedule specific meetings with the relevant committees in the Congress to describe exactly what is done and what is not done, and make sure the public itself is fully aware of the importance of the program, but also the privacy protections that have been put upon it and the oversight.
Would it be fair to say that if we failed to reauthorize it, even if we address some of the concerns that came up with the unmasking of maybe U.S. citizens, but would it be fair to say that if we failed to reauthorize 702, that it's probably going to lead to disastrous consequences?
I believe it would, and I think a lot of Americans will die unnecessarily.
Thank you.
Thank you very much. On behalf of Chairman McCain, Senator Peters, please.
Thank you, Senator Reid, and thank you to our witnesses today for your testimony. We know that China is currently executing a multi-decade strategic plan to acquire United States technologies that they believe will be foundational both to their future economic growth as well as to their military strength. The primary tool that we use is to block or mitigate foreign investments that pose a national security risk is the Committee on Foreign Investment in the United States, or CFIUS. Both of you I know are very familiar with this, and because the intelligence community plays a key role in the process developing the national security threat assessment used to inform committee decisions. Based on its current mandate, however, CFIUS reviews transactions just on a case-by-case basis rather than a strategic assessment of acquisitions or acquirers, and only those transactions that involve a controlling interest by foreign investors. However, as we've seen recently and continue to see on a regular basis, other transaction types such as joint ventures and minority investments also can result in the transfer of key technologies that are outside of CFIUS jurisdiction. And at the same time, the intelligence community's CFIUS workload is also increasing rapidly. A workload marked by increased Chinese investment in the very technologies that are the key to U.S. Innovation and military advantage, including autonomous vehicles, artificial intelligence, robotics, virtual reality, as well as gene editing. So, Mr. Coates, my question is, CFIUS remains a voluntary process, which I think underscores the importance of the intelligence community to identifying both unreported and non-notified transactions that may pose a national security risk. What are some of the challenges in finding the technical expertise necessary to understand and resolve potential national security implications across this very diverse threat spectrum?
I'd like General Stewart to address this also, but this issue has been raised and it is under consideration, and I think your questions are very valid relative to the current status of CFIUS and whether or not adjustments need to be made. Relative to finding the right technical capabilities to assess this, we are in contest with the private sector that offers significantly higher compensation for the people they hire and probably a better work schedule. Nevertheless, we are blessed with people who want to give service to their government and to work longer hours with lesser pay, but bring technical capabilities. We are out trying to recruit these people constantly, whether you're talking to Admiral Rogers at National Security Agency or other of our agencies. We need to understand that at a certain point, to gain the kind of technical capabilities that we need, we may have to look at our salary structure because just about every major corporation in America now, whether it's cyber or other issues, are looking to find people with these capabilities. Nothing is more important than protecting the safety of Americans, and that's the first responsibility of government. So I do think on two areas, on the basis of what you have said, we ought to do a significant review of the current CFIUS situation to bring it up to speed, number one, and then look at how we can get the best and the brightest to be able to help us with that. And Vince, if you want.
So before the answer, General, so I could take from your answer that that we need to really fully examine the CFIUS authorization and have a top-to-bottom review of that. Would you agree, General, as well as, General, if you'd also respond to the fact that right now you have a considerable workload before you now that continues to expand, and how that reauthorization may be necessary to help you would be appreciated.
I wasn't trying to give Vince more work.
Right, right.
That's okay, I'll take it. Yes, so China has approached leap ahead technology, whether legal or illegal, transferring intellectual property, transferring of knowledge, acquiring corporate sector, private sector industry to get that technology, insertion of students into the upstream development of technology and the capabilities. So yes, all of that needs to be reviewed, especially in light of the fact voluntary primarily, and the workload continues to grow. We did 174 CFIUS cases last year. We're on a pace for 250 this year, and no growth built in. So this is going to get harder, more demanding, and we're going to lose opportunities if we don't review the authorization.
Great. Thank you, gentlemen.
Thank you. On behalf of the Chairman, Senator Perdue, please.
Thank you both for being here. General Stewart, you said in your opening remarks that we've gone from a 1+1 strategy in our military to today we have 4+1. You just mentioned 5, North Korea, Russia, China, Iran, extremists. On top of that, we have cyber and space. The question I have, and I'm sort of a bottom line guy, I want to talk about China and Russia, our two symmetric contrarian threats, I believe. China is spending right now, next year, or this year, it's projected in real equivalent purchasing power parity terms, they'll spend $826 billion on their military. We'll spend directionally $600 million, and I would argue that today we have the smallest army since World War II, the smallest Navy since World War I, and the smallest and oldest Air Force ever. Sir, in your mind, what is China's purpose in this massive buildup that they are in the midst of right now?
Purpose number one to be able to fight and win in the Pacific. Xi Jinping
Would you
has
say they're on parity with us in the Pacific today? Does your intelligence reveal that?
In some aspects, and I won't talk about them here, there's
Right.
parity, but in some areas we are still far superior. And we look at them in all domains: space, cyberspace, air, land, surface, sea and surface. So we're competing in all those domains. Primary objective, fight and win in the Pacific, be prepared if the United States enter the conflict in the Pacific, and increase the cost of any of our actions in the Pacific.
Are you concerned about the PLA reorganization in China, and what effect does our intelligence say it'll have on our ability to stand up to them?
So they not only continue to reorganize, they continue to refine tactics, they continue to refine doctrine. We have not seen them do the major end-to-end full-scale rehearsal that says all of those pieces are stitched together in a real war-fighting capability.
Right.
So they're building pieces, but it's not fully integrated at this point.
Sorry. Director, it's hard to call you director, but I'm glad I can. Thank you. Today, Africa is a major involvement for China, economically, militarily. They're building a base right now in Djibouti, just miles away from our base at Lemonnier. What is the purpose of that base, and are you concerned? What does our intelligence say that their objective is in Africa?
Well, the Chinese are expanding their influence globally. They are looking at areas of the world that you wouldn't necessarily think a regional power like China would want to be engaged in, but whether it's Africa, whether it's Latin America, whether it's any number of places, the Chinese are making substantial investments, and sometimes linking that, as you mentioned, with Djibouti and building a base there. But I think they view that as a part of their long-term strategy to become a global power, not just a regional power. And they are spending an extraordinary amount of effort in investment. That One Belt road situation gives them access, expedited access to Europe, but access also to the Indian Ocean region and the Middle East. So they've been very aggressive in pursuing those types of initiatives, I think with a long-term strategy in mind of being a global power.
General, Russia...
Can I add
yes,
to that,
sir.
if I could? One Belt, One Road is about getting access to resources and access to markets. And if you want access to resource, access to markets, you've got to build infrastructure to defend your economic lifeline.
I want to get to Russia, but history says that the country with the largest and strongest economy will have the largest and strongest military. Today, China's economy is on parity with the U.S. when adjusted for purchasing power parity. They have a much stronger growth rate, and I think that's one of the things we have to deal with. I want to move to Russia very quickly. I only have a minute left. General, Russia in the last 5 years has dramatically changed their global footprint. They have Murmansk, Kaliningrad, Crimea now, and now Tartus and Latakia on the coast of Syria. In your mind, what does our intelligence say that Russia intends to do with that encircling of that part of the world with those major bases, now warm water and cold water?
The encirclement, as you describe it, the Western anti-access barrier, runs from the Arctic through the Bering, the Murmansk, through Kaliningrad, Crimea, and down, is to break out of the encirclement, their words, caused by NATO countries in their near abroad. So again, the anti-access, anti-denial capability is to increase the cost of any U.S. NATO action against Russia and to protect and give them buffer space. I don't think they're done. I think they'd like to extend that barrier down through the Mediterranean. I'm worried about actions that they might take in Libya to increase that barrier. But that is about breaking out of the NATO encirclement.
Thank you, sir. Thank you.
On behalf of Chairman McCain, Senator McCaskill, please.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I was pleased that the President went to Arab nation, a Muslim country, as his first visit, signaling to the world that we want to have allies in the Muslim world, that this is very important. My question to the two of you are we sending enough signals like that to the American Muslim community? I think I've heard you all and others that have jobs like yours in our government say that the biggest threat is the radicalization of people that are legally in this country not Syrian refugees, not people traveling here from other countries, but what we have seen is the radicalization of people that either are American citizens or are legally in the country and have been for some time. So do you all feel comfortable that we're doing enough to reach out to the American Muslim community, especially for personnel that we can use as maybe our most valuable assets in terms of what you all need to do within the intelligence community?
I don't have an assessment of how we're reaching out to the American Muslim community in general. I can say relative to our intelligence community, we realize that the diversity of ethnic, cultural, any number of ways is important for us to understand the world that we live in and understand, get a better understanding from people who bring different assessments in different cultures and give us the diversity we need to fully understand what's going on.
Yeah, that's
very much a part of our recruitment.
What worries me is that in America, there are too many people I've talked to, wonderful American Muslims who are feel very disconnected right now. And there is a tendency when that happens to internalize and not come forward, and especially if they have some concerns about somebody being radicalized. Do you all share that concern, and are you all taking steps with the intelligence community to deal with that concern?
Well, we do not see that as the role of the intelligence community, except in the area of, as I described, how we hire, promote, train, and incorporate people from different cultures, different ethnic backgrounds. And so
when you guys see, let me interrupt you just for a second, Director, but when you see evidence that someone might be radicalized through the gathering of intelligence here in America, do you hand that intelligence off to someone who could then circle around to people within that Muslim community and that geographical area to try to get confirmation or additional evidence that would allow us to put people in prison like we did Nasir for when we thwarted his effort on the New York subway system, and he's in our prisons now for 40 years?
Well, the FBI is in a way, is a part of the intelligence system, but there's a division between the investigatory and potential criminal activity that the FBI has control over relative to the intelligence aspect of the FBI. So that's something that if information is garnered, it's passed on to the FBI to determine whether or not there is an investigation or potential criminal element in play.
Okay. Let me briefly, because I only have a minute left, I'm worried about chemical weapons in North Korea. Can you all, open source reporting has indicated that Kim Jong-nam's half-brother may have been assassinated with VX gas. There are those who have, the Nuclear Threat Initiative has indicated they have 5,000 metric tons of chemical weapons in North Korea. Can you confirm that VX was used to kill Kim Jong-un's half-brother?
That's something that I'd have to get back to you with.
Yeah. We train on chemical weapon defenses at Fort Leonard Wood, and I know that this obviously with the proximity of so many millions of people in South Korea, and the deliverance, especially of VX, could be in such a way that it would be devastating. And I'm wondering if we have enough assets. Admiral Harris is trying to check to see if we have assets on the ground as it relates to chemical weapons.
Chemical weapons is assessed to be part of the North Korean arsenal.
Okay. If there's any other information you all can provide me on that in terms of our capabilities, in terms of defense of that, I'd be very appreciative. Thank you both for your service to our country.
Thank you very much. Because of the pending vote, I must depart. Let me recognize Senator Sullivan and ask him to further recognize members in order of their appearance. If the chairman does not return, we expect he'll return shortly.
Okay, Mr. Chair, I'm going to go vote myself after these questions.
Okay. Then let me go ahead and recognize Senator Sullivan, then Senator King, then Senator Kane, unless a Republican member intervenes, and then that person will be recognized. And Senator Blumenthal also. So, and I'll try to get back here as quickly as I can. Senator Sullivan, please.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. And gentlemen, thank you for your testimony. Director Coates, great to see you. I appreciate your focus in your written statement on the North Korean ICBM threat with regard to nuclear weapons. It's obviously a new direct threat to the United States. There's been testimony across the board in terms of our military and intelligence officials' public testimony that it's no longer a matter of if, but when Kim Jong-un is going to have the capability to hit not just a state like mine, Alaska or Hawaii, which are much closer in range, but the lower 48 continental United States with an intercontinental ballistic nuclear missile at some point. So I and a number of members of this committee, bipartisan, have introduced a bill yesterday. It's looking at significantly enhancing and advancing our homeland missile defense. But I'd like to get your sense in terms of the estimates. What do you think the estimates are with regard to when Kim Jong-un will be able to have this capability? I think it's a very important question. I know that you don't have a precise date, but I think that the American people need to know it's probably a lot sooner than most people anticipate. Can you give us a range of, a window on when you think that capability is going to exist for this very unstable leader who has threatened to shoot nuclear missiles at our homeland?
I would like to be able, I'll turn to General Stewart, but I think we both like to be able to talk to you about that in a classified manner session. I would say this, I mean, we certainly assess that this is the intent of North Korea, and Kim Jong-un has been publicly stated that they would like to have intercontinental ballistic missile capability, attached nuclear capability that could reach the United States, and they are on that goal. But relative to exactly where we are and what and when, of course, is dependent on their testing and ability. As I testified in my opening statement here, that they have not reached that capability yet.
Right, but there's been public testimony from military leaders, intel leaders, that they're going to get it. Not if, but when. So I know that we have estimates. I know that some of them are classified. I actually just think it's very useful to let the American people know. This isn't 15 years off. This isn't 10 years off. General, can you give us an estimate? Just
I would,
within a couple years. I mean, it's actually a really important issue. People are going to wake up to it someday, relatively soon. And it's an enormous threat. And I think the more we're able to be public about it, the better. So let me just repeat. It's been stated in open testimony a number of times before this committee. It's going to happen. It's going to happen. He's going to have that capability. Can you just give us a window of what the best estimates are on that intel?
as I said this earlier, left unchecked, it's going to happen. Would not.
How about a window?
I would, if I gave you a window, it would be potential to reveal the insights that we have on the capability. So we won't do that here. But it is inevitable if left unchecked.
Let me turn to Iran. Under the Iran nuclear agreement, Iran is restricted to 130 metric tons of heavy water. However, in 2016, the IAEA reported that they had, in fact, Iran, surpassed that threshold twice. So do you believe that Iran is in violation of the agreement right now?
The intelligence assessment relative to the certification that was signed perhaps, I think, 3 or 4 weeks ago.
And that was the certification by the IAEA, correct?
That's a certification that we have to provide to the Congress every 90 days.
But isn't that based on the IAEA's assessment?
It is based on IAEA assessments as well as our own assessments.
So how much confidence do we have in that assessment that said Iran was in full compliance when in 2016 the IAEA said that they violated the heavy water provisions twice? It's something that I think's a real disconnect between what the facts seem to be and what the Secretary Tillerson stated and what our intel community is saying. How can we say they're in compliance?
I apologize to the senator, but we agreed at the beginning that Director Coates and General Stewart would be out of here in 5 minutes, and we have.
Mr. Chairman, can I just get an answer to that question, please?
No. We've got 3 people to be in 5 minutes. I apologize. Senator Blumenthal, would you do me the favor of asking one question and allowing the other 2 to ask a question? Would that be agreeable to you, Director Coates? Just one question each.
Yeah, I appreciate that, Mr. Chairman, and I apologize. I mean, I don't apologize, but I have an event at the Supreme Court with the Chief Justice, and we want to not be late on that.
Could we each, would that be agreeable to the members to have a question each? Senator Blumenthal.
Director Coates, thank you very much for being here, and I know that given that the oath that you've taken and your long record of public service, you would never allow anyone, including the President of the United States, to discourage or deter you from a lawful investigation, and your non-denial of the Washington Post report, I think, should lead to even more intensive investigation of the alleged effort by the President to enlist you in shutting down or stifling that investigation. This evidence, if true, goes to criminal intent and constitutes mounting evidence of obstruction of justice. And you're aware that obstruction is a crime, and I'm sure that you will cooperate in investigation of that crime. And I presume that you would not agree with the President of the United States that this investigation of Russian meddling and possible collusion by the Trump campaign in that interference in our election is a witch hunt. And therefore, I want to ask you whether you have discussed efforts by the President to stifle or stop the investigation or enlist you or Admiral Rogers in denying that such an investigation of collusion focused on him, whether you've ever discussed these reports with anyone, including Admiral Rogers.
Well, Senator, as I said in my opening statement, I'm not going to characterize my conversations that I've had with the President.
I'm not asking about your conversation with the President. I don't mean to be misunderstood. Have you talked about this issue with Admiral Rogers?
That is something that I would like to withhold that question at this particular point in time.
I'm going to assume that in withholding the question, the implicit answer is that yes, you have. And I would like to know in another setting, if necessary, what the substance of that conversation was.
Let me just say for the record, Director Coates, your response to my question no means meant yes or no. It meant that your conversations with the President are private. And so Senator Blumenthal can have his interpretation. My interpretation of your answer to my question was that it's privileged conversations between the President and members of his team, Senator King. So I in no way interpret your response to my question as inferring anything except that you are keeping with the tradition of privacy of conversations between members of the President's national security team and the President.
And Mr. Chairman, I respect that
Senator
point.
King.
Thank you.
Thank you. Senator King.
Is the intelligence community
Director Coates, doing an assessment of the nature and impact of the information revealed to the Russian ambassador and Russian foreign minister by the President?
I'm sorry, would you repeat?
Is there an assessment being done or has been done of the significance and impact of the release of that information?
We have not initiated an assessment of that. There are procedures that we go through to determine when assessments have been made or need to be made. And there's a process that we go through. It's my understanding we have not initiated.
And there has been has there been any reaction from other countries to the intelligence community about the revealing of this information to the Russians?
This is
any reaction from other countries to the intelligence community?
I do not. Of course, I'm just back from some of those countries. The issue was not raised during my time there on that specific question.
The intelligence communities of other countries did not raise this issue with you at all on your trip?
They did not raise that specific question.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
And Senator Kane.
Thank you to the witnesses.
I thank the members' indulgence. Senator Kane.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. In the aftermath of the recent budget deal that was reached here in Congress in late April, the President tweeted out something, there might be time for a, quote, good shutdown, close quote, in September. With respect to the missions of both of your agencies, the DIA and then the Directorate of National Intelligence, in terms of dealing with worldwide threats, the topic of today's hearing, is there anything good about would there be anything good about a shutdown of the government of the United States?
Well, there might be some good and some bad. I mean, if the shutdown involved functions that were not producing or essential, but if you're talking about across-the-board shutdown, I've never believed that that is the way we ought to handle our business here, and that definitely it could potentially have an impact on our ability and collection.
General Stewart.
Not only would it impact our operations, but it has a debilitating effect on the workforce. Every time we talk about shutting down and they have uncertainty as to how they're going to get paid the next payday. Debilitating effect.
Thank you. Thanks, Mr. Chair.
I thank you, Director Coates and General Stewart, and I know this is a very difficult time, and I appreciate your candor, and I also know that the committee understands there's areas that simply are protected by the relationship that the President has with his team and the people he relies on. So, and I would like to repeat again that there's a lot more to be found out, but also these leaks are not good for your business. Isn't that correct?
That is absolutely correct. They are devastating, and as I've said, disclosing methods and sources put our patriot people who are doing great service for this country, puts their lives at risk, and it puts the lives of Americans at risk because it details the methods of which we have gained information that has prevented attacks against the United States.
So do you believe that there are lives at risk because of these leaks?
Potentially, yes.
I thank you. Did you want to say anything else?
Well, I wanted to ask the witness in follow-up to your question, which would you consider worse, a leak to the American people or a leak to the Russian foreign minister?
This hearing is adjourned.
Mr. Chairman, can I ask one quick question? No? Okay. That's all right. Thank you.
I did assure, and we'll be seeing him again, unfortunately for him.